You weren't supposed to be in that room." The words came from behind me, and I froze so completely that the folded edge of the sheet I was tucking slipped from my fingers and fell open again across the mattress. I didn't turn around. Not immediately. My body made that decision before my brain had any say in it. Some instinct older than thought, telling me that turning around too fast in a moment like this was the kind of mistake you didn't get to explain your way out of. I had been working at the Harlow estate for 11 days. 11 days of learning which hallways to avoid after 7 in the evening, which rooms required a second knock regardless of whether anyone answered, and which of the other staff members would talk to me, versus which ones would stare through me like I was made of something they'd decided not to see. The estate itself sat on the outer edge of a gated community in Bethesda, Maryland. Old money architecture dressed up in newer security. The kind of place where the cameras were tasteful, and the silence was expensive. My agency had placed me there after my previous contract ended abruptly, and I'd been grateful enough not to ask too many questions about the client. That had been my first mistake. "I was assigned the East Wing today," I said, keeping my voice flat and professional. "Mrs. Cho's schedule said, Mrs. Cho doesn't make assignments for the 3rd floor." I turned around then, because not turning felt worse. He was standing in the doorway, not blocking it exactly, but positioned in a way that made the doorway feel smaller than it was. Min-jun. I knew his name the way you know a storm system's name, from other people's mouths, always spoken just slightly below a normal volume. He was younger than I'd imagined. That was the first thing that hit me, and it hit me strangely, like finding out a word you'd been pronouncing wrong your whole life. Late 20s at most, dressed in a dark suit with the collar open just enough to reveal the edge of ink crawling up the side of his neck. His hair was pushed back from his face, and he was watching me with an expression that wasn't anger. It was more precise than anger. It was the look of someone calculating something about you while you stood there, not knowing what the equation was. Behind him, barely visible in the hallway, 2 men stood at a distance that was meant to look casual and didn't. My heart was doing something unreasonable inside my chest. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm, a habit I'd had since childhood, something to focus on. "I apologize," I said. "I'll check with Mrs. Cho directly going forward." He didn't respond right away. That was the thing about him. I would come to understand this more over time. But even then, in that first moment, there was something off about the rhythm of how he occupied space. He looked at me the way people look at something they're trying to read in bad light. His jaw moved, almost imperceptibly, like he was about to say something and then decided against the first version of it. Ava. My name. Just that. And I had no idea how he knew it. "Yes," I said, "because what else do you say when someone who runs God knows what out of a $10 million estate in Maryland says your name like it's a question they already know the answer to?" He looked at the bed I'd been making, the sheet still half undone from when I'd startled, and then back at me. Something shifted in his face. Not softened exactly. Shifted. Like a room rearranging itself by a fraction of an inch. "Finish," he said. And then he left. I stood there for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. The 2 men in the hallway had already disappeared. The corridor was quiet. I turned back to the bed and started tucking the sheet again, and my hands were not entirely steady, and I hated that they weren't. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. The other staff. There were 6 of us through the agency, plus a handful of full-time employees who had been there for years, operated under an unspoken code of not discussing the 3rd floor at all. The housekeeper, a thin woman named Dara, who communicated mostly through tight smiles and pointed silences, had given me a 2-page orientation document on my first day that listed every room and its access level. The 3rd floor rooms had been marked with a small asterisk, no explanation offered, and I had been foolish enough to assume it was a cleanliness priority system. It was not a cleanliness priority system. Over the next week, I adjusted my routes. I kept to the lower floors, the kitchen corridor, the formal sitting rooms that were never actually sat in. I did my job the way I always did, quietly, thoroughly, without leaving a trace of myself in any room I'd cleaned. That was something I'd always been good at. The art of being present without being noticed. I'd been doing it my whole adult life in one way or another, in jobs and apartments and relationships that never quite fit the shape I thought they would. Invisibility had become a kind of skill, and I wore it like comfortable shoes. But Minjun noticed things. That became clear within days, not in any direct way. He didn't seek me out, didn't speak to me in any of the common areas, but I'd catch small signals. A water glass moved to the side of a table in a way that made my work easier, as if someone had anticipated where I'd need to reach. A door propped open to a room I'd have had to unlock. Once, a window latch that had been stiff for days was suddenly repaired without anyone mentioning it, without any maintenance crew appearing that I'd seen. I tried to tell myself I was imagining a pattern. People notice things and do small things for convenience all the time. It doesn't mean anything. But then there was the morning I arrived early, before 6, and found a coffee, black, in a paper cup from the cafe 3 miles down the road that I'd mentioned offhandedly to Dara, sitting on the kitchen counter near my supply cart. No note, no one around. I stood there staring at it for almost a minute before I picked it up. It was still warm. That afternoon, I did something I still can't fully explain. I was restocking linens in the second-floor closet, and I had a notepad with me. I always carried one for inventory notes. And I tore out a small page and wrote 4 words on it, folded it twice, and left it on the kitchen counter where the cup had been. Thank you. Ava. 4 words. Harmless, polite. The kind of thing any normal person would do. Except nothing about this place was normal, and I knew that, and I left the note anyway. I didn't see him that day. I finished my shift, changed in the staff room, and walked to my car in the early evening dark. The air had that early October edge to it, cold enough to feel, but not enough to bite, and the leaves in the drive were turning and no one had raked them yet. I sat in my car for a moment before starting it, and I thought about the note, and I thought about how small and stupid it was, and I drove home. My apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building in Silver Spring. Nothing remarkable about it. 2 rooms and a bathroom and a window that looked out onto the back of another building. I heated up leftovers and watched something on my phone that I wasn't really watching. And by 9 o'clock I had mostly convinced myself the note was nothing. My phone lit up with an unknown number just after 9:30. I stared at it for 3 full rings before answering. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I almost hung up. And then a voice. Quiet, measured, carrying the faint but unmistakable weight of someone who was not accustomed to being the one to call, said, "You have good handwriting." I forgot for a moment how to respond to anything. Thank you, I said, because apparently the only thing I knew how to do in situations involving Minjun was say thank you back. Another silence. Longer this time. And in it, something strange happened. I heard the faint sound of him exhaling, almost like the beginning of a word that didn't make it out. Like his voice had started somewhere and then lost its way. Do you... A pause. A different kind of pause than the deliberate silences I'd seen from him before. This one had texture. Roughness. Do you need anything? For work? I sat there on my couch in Silver Spring with my leftover pasta going cold on the coffee table. And I understood in the same moment 2 things that didn't fit together at all. That the most quietly powerful man I had ever been in a room with had just stuttered on the phone to me, and that I was, without question, already in something I had no map for. "No," I said softly. "I'm okay. Thank you for asking." He hung up without another word. I held the phone in my hand for a long time after that, looking at the dark screen, trying to figure out what I'd just heard, and why. Instead of frightened, I felt something else entirely. Something I didn't have a clean word for yet. Outside, a car sat parked just below my window that hadn't been there that morning. I noticed it, and I didn't call anyone about it, and I didn't entirely understand why. I told myself it was a coincidence. The car, a dark gray sedan, Nothing flashy, nothing that would make a normal person look twice, was gone by the time I left for work the next morning. No plates I'd managed to read, no face I'd seen behind the wheel. Just a car parked on a residential street in a city full of parked cars, and me standing at my window at 11 at night reading meaning into something that probably had none. That's what I told myself. I was good at that, constructing reasonable explanations, and then living inside them like they were load-bearing walls. The drive to Bethesda the next morning was quiet. I had a playlist I always listened to on work mornings. Nothing dramatic. Just background sound to keep my thoughts from stacking up too high before the day started. I drank my gas station coffee, and I watched the traffic thin out as I got further from the city center, and I thought about my note. 4 words. Thank you. Ava. I had signed it like I was leaving a tip at a restaurant. Like that was a thing you did. Like I had not left a personally signed message on the kitchen counter of a man whose last name I didn't know, and whose business I understood only in the vague, outline sketch way that you understand things you've decided not to look at directly. By the time I pulled through the gate, I had resolved to be normal about it. Professional. It was a courteous gesture in response to a courteous gesture, and that was the entirety of it. And whatever strange phone call had happened the night before was simply him being... what? Thoughtful. Checking in. A man who ran staff, checking on staff. That was plausible. That was the version I chose to carry into the building with me. Dara met me in the kitchen corridor before I'd even reached my cart. "You're on East Wing again today," she said, handing me a revised sheet without looking up from her clipboard. "Second floor only," Mr. Kwan asked specifically. I took the paper. Mr. Kwan, the client. She said it the way you say the weather, a fact, not a subject. She was already turning away. Did he say why? She stopped, turned back just far enough to look at me over her shoulder. There was something in her expression that I couldn't read. Not quite a warning, not quite pity. Something in between. He didn't need to, she said. I spent the morning on the second floor East Wing, which was nothing remarkable. A guest suite, a reading room lined with books I doubted anyone had opened recently, a bathroom with fixtures that cost more than my monthly rent. I moved through the rooms with the practiced efficiency I'd built over years of this kind of work, and I tried not to think too hard. The house had its sounds. Old buildings always do. The shifting of walls, the hum of systems running behind the plaster, footsteps on upper floors that traveled through the structure in muffled, directionless ways. Around 11, I heard voices. Not close. Somewhere above me, muffled enough that I couldn't make out words. But the tone carried. There were at least 3 people, and whatever they were discussing was not casual. One voice was louder than the others, tightly controlled in the way that loud voices get when they're being kept from becoming something worse. And then it stopped. Clean cut, like someone had closed a door, followed by silence so complete it almost had a weight. I kept working. 20 minutes later, I was in the hallway collecting my supply caddy when I heard him on the stairs. Not because he made noise, but because the 2 men who were always somewhere nearby made the particular non-sound of people adjusting their position. I had started to notice that, the way the air shifted around Minjun before he appeared, like a change in pressure before rain. He came around the landing and stopped when he saw me. I thought about the phone call, about the stutter, about the version of him I'd heard for 30 seconds at 9:30 at night, which was so different from the version currently standing at the base of the stairs, in a charcoal suit with his hands loose at his sides, and an expression that gave away nothing. "Good morning," I said, because starting with something ordinary felt like the only stable ground available. He looked at me. A beat passed. Morning. Just that. And the small break in the word was so brief, so quickly recovered, that if I hadn't been listening for it, I might have missed it entirely. His jaw tightened afterward. Not much, but enough for me to see that he'd noticed it too, and that he did not like having been heard. I looked back down at my caddy, and started straightening things that didn't need straightening. The reading room on the left. The window latch is stiff again, I said, keeping my tone neutral and practical. I didn't want to force it. A pause. I'll have it looked at. Thank you. Stop thanking me. I looked up at that. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't anything close to aggressive, but it landed with enough directness that I felt it in my sternum. He was looking at me with that same calculating expression from the first day, except there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Something that looked almost like frustration. Not at me exactly. At himself, maybe. At something about this interaction that wasn't going the way things usually went for him. I didn't respond. I thought that was the right call. He moved past me down the corridor, and the two men reappeared from somewhere and followed. And within seconds the hallway was empty again, and I was standing there holding a bottle of wood polish I didn't remember picking up. The days took on a rhythm after that. Not a simple one. Nothing about that house was simple, but a rhythm nonetheless. I learned where I was welcome and where I wasn't, and the invisible boundary between those two categories shifted slightly, almost daily, in ways I couldn't always track. Rooms I hadn't been assigned before appeared on my schedule. Small things continued to happen that I filed under coincidence and then stopped filing there because the folder was getting full. Once, I came in from a rainy Wednesday morning to find a dry towel folded on top of my supply cart, because someone had seen or known I'd be wet from the parking lot, and there was no covered walkway. Once, a broken strap on my work bag had been replaced overnight. I'd left the bag in the staff room the evening before, and in the morning it was whole again. No explanation offered. And once, on a Friday afternoon when I stayed late to finish a deep clean of the formal dining room, I walked past the main hallway and saw Minjun sitting alone in the small adjacent study with the door half open, a glass of something untouched on the table beside him, staring at nothing with the particular stillness of someone carrying something very heavy inside a very quiet container. He didn't see me. Or if he did, he didn't show it. I walked on. But I thought about that image for the rest of the evening. The stillness of him. The untouched glass. The way the room around him seemed to hold its breath. The following Tuesday, I found out something I hadn't been meant to find out. I was in the supply room off the kitchen, doing inventory. A tedious but necessary task that required me to cross-reference a physical list with what was actually on the shelves. One of the other agency staff, a guy named Troy, who'd been there longer than me and seemed to understand the unspoken geography of the house in a way that occasionally made me nervous, came in to grab something and didn't notice me immediately behind the shelving unit. He was on the phone. Yeah, she's still here. The new one. A pause. I don't know, man. He keeps adjusting her schedule. That's not normal. Dara's losing her mind about it. Another pause, and then his voice dropped a register. Word from one of the full-timers is he's never done that before. Not for anyone. They're saying it's the note, but that sounds insane to me. He grabbed what he came for and left without ever seeing me standing 4 feet away. I stood there in the supply room for a moment, the clipboard in my hands, the inventory half done. The note. I thought about the phone call again, about the stutter, about doors propped open, and a cup of coffee from a cafe 3 miles away, and a bag strap replaced like it was nothing. I thought about the car outside my window, and for the first time, I let myself admit, standing in a supply closet in a house in Bethesda surrounded by cleaning products and extra linens, that whatever was happening here was not going to resolve itself into something ordinary. That I had, without any particular intention, caught the attention of someone who did not give his attention casually, and that the world operating around that man was not a world where attention was a small thing. The inventory list blurred slightly in front of me. I put it down, pressed both palms flat against the shelf in front of me, breathed. Then I picked it back up and finished the count, because the work still needed doing, and because I wasn't ready yet to decide what I was going to do about any of the rest of it. There are things you know, and things you let yourself know, and for a while I had been keeping those two categories very carefully separated. I knew that Minjun Kwan was not simply a wealthy private client with unusual security preferences. I knew that the men who moved through that house weren't personal assistants or housekeeping supervisors or any other reasonable explanation. I knew that the phone calls that sometimes came to the estate's landline late at night, the ones that made Dara's posture change and sent the full-time staff into a particular kind of careful silence, were not business calls in any conventional sense of the word. I knew all of this the way you know the smell of rain before it arrives. Not from seeing it, but from everything around you responding to it. What I had not let myself know, until that supply closet moment, was that I was already inside it. Not on the edges, not passing through, inside. I went home that Tuesday, and I sat with it. Really sat with it, the way you sit with something you've been circling for too long. My apartment felt smaller than usual, which was saying something. I made tea I didn't drink, and I stood at my window, and I looked at the street below. And the gray sedan was not there, and I didn't know if that made me feel better or worse. What I kept coming back to was the stutter. It didn't fit. That was the thing that snagged every time I tried to smooth the whole picture flat. A man who controlled rooms by walking into them, who communicated entire instructions through a single look, who had people around him who moved like extensions of his will. That man had stumbled over a single syllable on the phone with me, had started a sentence and lost it, had called at 9:30 at night to ask if I needed anything for work, and the question had come out fractured and quiet, like it cost him something to ask it. I was 31 years old. I had a practical nature and a limited tolerance for self-deception, and I could not make that stutter fit any version of the story where I was simply staff he was mildly aware of. I went to work the next morning, and I was careful, carefully normal, carefully professional. I did my job without variation, without leaving notes, without making eye contact that lasted a beat too long. If there was a strategy available to me, it was that one. Reduce myself back to background, back to invisible, back to the shape of a person no one had reason to focus on. It lasted approximately 4 days. On Saturday, the estate hosted something. I wasn't told what. Dara simply added it to our schedules as an event preparation block starting at 7 in the morning, and by the time I arrived, the first floor had already been rearranged in ways that made the formal rooms look less like display spaces and more like places people would actually occupy. Round tables in the dining room, a bar set up in the west sitting room, flowers I would never have chosen, but that probably cost more than my weekly pay arranged with precise casualness on every surface. There were people I hadn't seen before moving through the house. Not guests yet. It was early. But support staff, catering crews, a woman with a tablet who seemed to be running a logistical operation of her own that intersected with ours in complicated and slightly tense ways. I kept out of it as much as possible. Did what I was assigned. Polished things that were already polished, straightened things that were already straight, and tried to remain the invisible version of myself that I had decided was safest. By 4 in the afternoon, guests had begun to arrive. I was supposed to be off the main floor by then, restocked and finished. But a situation with a backed-up bathroom on the second floor kept me running later than planned, and by the time I came back down the service stairs with my caddy, the front of the house was already populated with people in expensive clothes, speaking in low, layered conversations that overlapped like weather systems. I moved along the wall. Head down, cart steady, purposeful trajectory toward the staff exit at the back of the kitchen corridor. I had almost made it. Ava. His voice. Quiet, as always, but carrying through the ambient noise of the room in a way that made me understand something about frequency and attention. That when you were already tuned to something, you heard it clearly through any amount of interference. I stopped. Turned. Minjun was standing near the entrance to the sitting room, slightly apart from a cluster of men who were doing the thing that groups of powerful people do at events, maintaining a posture of ease while actually surveying everything around them. He was looking directly at me. He had a glass in his hand that he wasn't drinking from. I crossed toward him because the alternative was walking away from him in a room full of his people, which felt like a worse option than whatever this was. I'm just finishing up, I said quietly, stopping a few feet from him. I'll be out of your way. He didn't respond to that. His eyes moved from me to somewhere to my left, a brief flicker, and when I followed his gaze, I saw a man I didn't recognize standing near the bar, mid-40s, heavy build, watching me with an interest that had nothing professional about it. When my eyes reached him, he smiled in a way that I felt on the back of my neck. I looked back at Minjun. Something had changed in his expression. Barely perceptible, but I was getting better at reading the small register he operated in. His jaw was set in a way it hadn't been 30 seconds ago. His thumb moved once, slowly, along the base of his glass. "Stay," he said. Just that word. I'm not dressed for... I looked down at my uniform. Practical black, sensible shoes, hair pulled back. I was the most obviously out-of-place person in this room. "Stay," he said again. Not louder, not different in tone. Just repeated, with the quiet certainty of someone who had not considered the possibility of a different outcome. I stayed. What followed was one of the stranger evenings of my life, and I had some competition for that category. I wasn't asked to serve or assist. I was simply present, positioned near enough to Minjun that anyone paying attention could read the geometry of it. One of his men brought me a drink without being asked. A different woman from the catering staff shot me a glance that I couldn't fully interpret. The man from the bar, I learned later his name was Reeves, some kind of associate from out of town, drifted nearer twice, and both times, something subtle happened in the room that redirected him without any visible cause. A look exchanged between two of Minjun's people, a slight shift in how the group positioned itself. Minjun didn't hover. That would have been too obvious. And he was not a man who operated obviously. But he was always in my peripheral vision, always at an angle that put him between me and the parts of the room I hadn't been invited into. At one point, he was pulled into a conversation on the far side of the room. Serious faces, lowered voices, the energy of something that needed to be handled. And for 10 minutes, I stood near the window by myself, watching the dark garden outside and nursing my drink and feeling the strangeness of my own presence there very acutely. A woman appeared beside me, early 50s, elegant in a way that was entirely self-possessed rather than performative. She looked at the garden with me for a moment before she spoke. "He doesn't do this," she said pleasantly, like we were discussing the flower arrangements. "I'm sorry?" "Have someone stand with him at these things." She glanced at me sideways, assessing without being unkind. "It's not a criticism, dear. It's an observation." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "You're the maid," she said, still pleasant. Still like we were discussing flowers. "Housekeeper, through the agency." She smiled, and there was something in it that was almost fond. "Of course." She drifted away as easily as she'd arrived, and I stared at the garden for another moment, trying to decide if I'd just been warned about something. When I turned around, Minjun was already looking at me from across the room. The conversation around him was still happening. Someone was talking to him, making a point, using their hands, and he was nodding in the appropriate places. But his eyes were on me, with a steadiness that had nothing distracted about it. Like whatever was happening in front of him was the thing requiring only part of his attention, and the rest of it had decided, without consulting him, where it wanted to be. My chest did something I was running out of explanations for. I looked away first, down at my drink, at the floor, at nothing in particular. I counted to 5. Then I set my glass on a nearby table, straightened my shoulders, and walked to the staff exit with a calm and purposeful stride that I was approximately 60% certain I was actually pulling off. Behind me, I heard nothing. No voice, no footsteps. But when I pushed through the door into the kitchen corridor, one of his men was already there, leaning against the wall with his phone out, not blocking my path, but present in a way that made the word coincidence feel very tired. I changed in the staff room and collected my things. In the pocket of my jacket, folded against my badge, was a note card I hadn't put there. Thick paper, no envelope, 2 lines in handwriting that was precise and slightly angular. "You didn't have to stay, but I'm glad you did." I stood in the staff room alone, holding it under the fluorescent light, reading it twice. Then I put it back in my pocket and carried it home with me, and I did not tell myself it was nothing, because I had run out of room for that particular lie. I read that note card 4 more times before I fell asleep that night, which told me everything I needed to know about the state I was in, and nothing useful about what to do about it. The handwriting was careful, not rushed, not casual, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who learned it deliberately, who treated the act of putting words on paper as something that deserved attention. I kept thinking about that, about him writing it. About when exactly? During an evening full of people requiring things from him. He had found a moment to fold 2 sentences into a card and put it in the pocket of a jacket hanging in a staff room he had no business being in, or having someone do it for him, which was somehow both more and less unsettling. I put the card in the drawer of my nightstand and turned off the light and looked at the ceiling of my apartment for a long time. What I felt was not what I was supposed to feel. I knew that much with complete clarity. I was supposed to feel the weight of the situation, the obvious, practical, self-preserving alarm that should accompany any reasonable assessment of what Min Jun Kwon was and what his world contained. I had enough information for that alarm. I had heard the late-night phone calls and seen the way rooms changed when he entered them, and watched grown men adjust their posture in his direction like plants turning toward light they didn't choose. I had seen Reeves at the bar, and understood on some wordless level exactly what kind of problem Min Jun had quietly prevented from becoming a problem. The alarm was there. I'm not saying it wasn't. But underneath it, threaded through it, if I was being honest, was something else. Something that had started the moment I heard that stutter on the phone, and had been building quietly ever since. A kind of recognition, maybe. Or the specific tenderness you feel for something that presents as invulnerable and isn't. That was dangerous. I knew it was dangerous. I went to sleep knowing it was dangerous, and I woke up in the morning and it was still there. I took Sunday off because it was my scheduled day, and I had learned to protect my scheduled days like they were physical objects. I cleaned my own apartment, which was small enough that it took 40 minutes and left me with too much remaining day. I called my sister in Atlanta and talked for half an hour about things that had nothing to do with any of this. Her kids, a coworker situation she was navigating, whether our mother was actually going to visit for Thanksgiving, or was simply going to threaten to visit until everyone was exhausted. Normal conversation. Ordinary life. I held on to it with both hands for 30 minutes, and then it ended, and I was back in my apartment with the Sunday quiet and the note card in the nightstand drawer. I did not take it out again, but I was aware of it the whole day. Monday morning I arrived at the estate to find the atmosphere slightly different. Not dramatically. Nothing about that house operated dramatically. But the particular quality of the silence had changed. More staff moving with purpose and less eye contact. Dara met me in the corridor, gave me my assignments with even fewer words than usual, and turned away before I could ask anything. One of the full-time staff, an older man named Gerald, who sometimes nodded at me in a collegial way when we passed, looked at me that morning and then looked quickly away, which was new. I started my work and paid attention. By mid-morning I had pieced together, from fragments, a phrase overheard, attention in a doorway, the particular configuration of Min Jun's men on the ground floor, that something had happened. Not here, necessarily. Somewhere else, in whatever the larger shape of his world was. Something that had sent a low current of alertness through the entire house and changed the calibration of everyone in it. I didn't see Min Jun until just after noon. He came through the kitchen corridor while I was returning my caddy, and he was moving with a different energy than usual. Still controlled, still contained, but there was something underneath it that pressed against the surface in a way I hadn't seen before. His phone was in his hand. One of his men was speaking quietly behind him, and Min Jun was listening but barely, the way you listen to something when your attention is already deployed elsewhere. He saw me. Stopped. The man behind him stopped too, nearly walking into him, and recovered with professional smoothness. Minjun said something I didn't catch to the man, quiet, in Korean, brief, and the man stepped back and became very interested in his own phone. Then Minjun looked at me with that direct, reading in bad light expression and said, "Are you finished for today?" Not quite a question. Almost, but not quite. "Another hour," I said. He nodded once. Then, "Don't go to your car alone today." I felt my stomach drop, slowly, the way it does when something you've been managing in the abstract suddenly becomes specific. "What's happening?" The jaw, that small tightening. Nothing you need to concern yourself with. There it was again. That fractured syllable, punching through the controlled surface of him and disappearing before he could catch it. This time there was no recovery pause. He held my gaze and didn't look embarrassed exactly, but something close to exposed. Like a man who had been very careful for a very long time about what he allowed to show, and was discovering that careful had limits. Minjun. His name. I'd never said it out loud before, not to him, and it came out quieter than I'd intended, the two syllables sitting in the space between us like something newly placed there. "Tell me what I should know." A long moment, the house settling around us. The hum of the refrigeration unit in the kitchen, distant and mechanical and steady. "Reeves," he said finally. "He asked questions about you, after the event. Questions he had no reason to ask." I held very still. "He's been dealt with," Minjun added, and the phrase was flat and final in a way that I chose, deliberately, not to examine too closely. "But I want someone with you until you're off the property." I thought about Reeves at the bar, the smile I'd felt on the back of my neck, the way he'd tried to drift closer twice and been redirected both times by invisible mechanisms. "Okay," I said. Something in Minjun's posture changed, a fraction of release, barely visible. Like a breath he hadn't quite been taking, let out. "Okay," he repeated quietly. He left. His man fell back into step behind him. I stood in the kitchen corridor with my empty caddy and my heart doing its unreasonable thing, and I finished my hour. True to his word, one of his men, a younger one named Sio, who had the general demeanor of someone who had committed deeply to being unnoticeable, walked me to my car. We didn't make conversation. At my car door, he stopped, gave a small professional nod, and turned back toward the house without explanation. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. On the passenger seat was a small paper bag from the cafe 3 miles down the road. Inside, a coffee and a croissant I hadn't asked for, and a folded receipt on which someone had written, in that precise angular handwriting, "You said you skip breakfast when you come in early. Stop doing that." I stared at it. I thought about the fact that I had said that exactly once, to Dara, offhandedly, weeks ago, explaining why I sometimes took a longer lunch. A throwaway comment in a house full of people. And somehow it had traveled from wherever throwaway comments went in that house and landed here, in a paper bag, on my passenger seat, alongside a croissant. He had been listening. He had been listening to things I'd said without thinking anyone was really hearing, and he had been collecting them and doing something with them. And I did not have a clean category for what that was. I ate the croissant in the parking lot before I drove home, which felt both pathetic and entirely inevitable. That evening, I took the note card out of the nightstand drawer and put it on top, where I could see it without opening anything. I was not making a decision. I told myself that very clearly. I was simply acknowledging that I was in something, and that the in was real, and that the version of me who thought she could reduce herself back to invisible had been wrong about how visible she'd already become. My phone lit up at 9:45. Same unknown number. I answered on the second ring this time. The silence was shorter than before, and when his voice came, it was quieter even than usual. Stripped of the professional surface, just a voice in an evening. Slightly unsteady at the edges, in a way that had nothing to do with power or empire, or anything the rest of the world knew about Minjun Kwan. "I didn't like today," he said. A pause. "I don't like when things get close to you." My throat tightened. "I'm okay," I said. The same thing I'd said the first time. But the shape of it was different now. It landed differently, and we both knew it. "I know," he said. Another pause. Longer. I made sure of it. Outside my window, the gray sedan was back. And this time, when I looked at it from above in the dark, I didn't feel watched. I felt something that was harder to explain and easier to feel. The particular safety of knowing that someone has decided, without your permission and without apology, that you matter enough to guard. I didn't tell him to send it away. I just said goodnight and listened to the silence on the other end that lasted a beat longer than necessary, like he was waiting for something else, or not quite ready to let the line go dark. Then I went to bed, and I slept better than I had in weeks. There is a specific kind of morning that only happens in October in Maryland. The sky a flat, pale gray that isn't quite overcast. The air cold enough to see your breath but not cold enough to need more than a jacket. Everything slightly too still, like the day is waiting to find out what kind of day it wants to be. I drove to the estate in that stillness, and I let myself, for the first time since any of this had started, stop managing what I was feeling and just feel it. I was in love with him. Not fully. Not the deep-rooted, seasoned kind that takes years to grow. But the seed of it was there. Undeniable. Planted somewhere in the weeks between a folded note on a kitchen counter and a croissant on a passenger seat, and a voice that lost its footing specifically with me. I wasn't happy about it. I wasn't unhappy about it either. I was just honest about it. There in the car, in the gray October morning, for the 4 minutes it took to reach the estate gate. Then I put it away and went to work. Dara handed me my schedule with the particular neutrality she had developed around anything involving me and my assignments, which had become too irregular for her clipboard to absorb without visible discomfort. I had the second-floor east wing, the library, and the small study off the main hall. The one where I had seen Minjun sitting alone with an untouched glass weeks ago, carrying something heavy inside a quiet container. I saved the study for last. It was a small room. Dark wood, a desk that faced the window, 2 chairs positioned near a cold fireplace. The books on the shelves were organized in a way that suggested actual use rather than decoration. Spines worn at different rates, some leaning slightly where they'd been pulled out and replaced at angles. A room where someone actually came to think, not to be seen thinking. I worked slowly in there, dusted the shelves with genuine care, the way I did in rooms I liked. Cleaned the window without rushing. Straightened the desk without moving anything that didn't need moving, which in a room like this was important. A desk is a person's system, and a person's system is private. On the corner of the desk was a small framed photograph I hadn't noticed before, or hadn't let myself notice. A younger Minjun, maybe early 20s, standing beside an older woman with his same jaw and his same stillness. His mother, unmistakably. Neither of them were smiling. But there was something in how close they were standing that said everything a smile would have said. I looked at it for a moment longer than I should have, and then I kept working. He found me in the library just after 11. Not dramatically. He simply appeared in the doorway the way he always did, like the room had quietly rearranged its expectations to include him. I was on the rolling ladder, reaching for the upper shelf with a cloth, and I heard the particular non-sound of him entering, and looked down, and there he was. "You're going to fall," he said. "I'm not going to fall. The wheel on that ladder is loose." I looked down at the wheel. It was marginally slightly loose. I looked back at him. He was looking at the ladder with an expression that was trying to be neutral, and wasn't entirely succeeding. I climbed down. He watched me do it with an attention that he didn't bother to make less obvious, and when I reached the bottom and turned around, he was closer than I'd expected. Not crowding, Not inappropriate, but close enough that I had to adjust my understanding of the room's geometry. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands, I had never particularly noticed his hands before, or I had noticed them and not catalogued the observation. His hands were not entirely still. The fingers of his right hand moved once, briefly, against the seam of his trousers. A small thing. A human thing. "Okay," I said. A pause. He looked at the window behind me, then back at my face, and the looking away and back was such a different gesture from his usual directness that it rearranged something in my chest. What happened with Reeves? It won't be the last time something like that happens. Not while you're here. He held my gaze. Not while you're connected to me. People notice. And the people who notice me do it for reasons that aren't safe for someone who doesn't belong in this. I waited. "You don't belong in this," he said, and it was the most honest sentence I'd heard from anyone in months. Not cruel, just true, and he was giving it to me without softening it, which was its own kind of respect. "And yet here I am," I said. Something moved through his expression. "Ava, you could have let me be reassigned after the first week, after the third floor." I kept my voice even. "You didn't." He didn't say anything to that. Because there was nothing to say to it that wasn't an admission, and Minjun Kwan was someone who did not make admissions carelessly. "I know what you are," I said, quieter now. "I'm not pretending I don't. I'm not naive about what that means." I paused. "But I also know that you called me at 9:30 on a Tuesday to ask if I needed anything, and you couldn't get through the sentence, and you still called." I looked at him steadily. "That matters to me." The room was very quiet. His jaw worked once. His eyes, which had never once left my face through this entire conversation, were doing something complicated that I didn't have a name for and didn't need one. "This isn't a safe thing," he said finally. His voice was low. "What you're saying, it's not. I can't promise you." He stopped, started again. "I don't know how to do this, whatever this is. I don't." The break came harder this time, and he didn't push through it immediately. He stood in it for a moment, in the fractured space of the word, and let it be what it was. "I've never done this." "I know," I said. "That doesn't frighten you." It wasn't a question. He was checking something, taking a reading. "It did," I said honestly. "It doesn't anymore." What happened next was not dramatic. There was no sudden shift, no flood of words, no gesture that would read clearly from the outside as a turning point. He simply stood there for a moment longer, and then he moved, just slightly, just enough, and his hand came up and his fingers wrapped around mine where they were resting against the ladder rail, and he held them there. Not tightly, not possessively, just held the way you hold something you are trying very carefully not to break. His hand was warm. That surprised me somehow. I don't know what I expected. We stood like that for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes, and neither of us said anything. And the library held its breath around us. And through the window, the October sky had made up its mind and gone a softer, cleaner gray. Then he let go, stepped back, straightened, and the professional surface resettled over him like a coat. "Lunch is being brought in," he said, and his voice was back to its usual measured register. "Eat something." He left. I stood at the ladder rail for a moment with my hand still at my side, still warm where his had been. 3 weeks later, I was no longer with the agency. Not fired. The contract simply wasn't renewed, which in the industry means the same thing, but without requiring anyone to say it. Dara handed me my final paperwork with her tight smile and did not explain anything, and I thanked her and left. The following Monday, I received a call from an estate management firm in Bethesda, one I had never applied to, offering me a full-time position as a household manager for a private residential property. Competitive salary, benefits. The address they gave me was not the Harlow estate address. It was a smaller property, a private residence unmarked, in a quieter part of the same zip code. I knew whose it was before I visited. I knew when I pulled up to the gate and gave my name and was waved through without any checking, as if I'd been expected. I knew when I walked through the front door and found everything arranged with the same particular restraint and precision I had come to recognize as the signature of his presence. And I knew because on the kitchen counter, in the clean and quiet morning light of a house that was not yet familiar to me, there was a coffee from the cafe 3 miles away. Still warm. No note this time. He didn't need to write one. We were past the stage of notes, which was, in a way, how all of this had started. I wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out the window at the yard, at the October light doing something lovely to the leaves, and I thought about the woman who had written 4 words on a torn notepad page and left it on a counter not knowing what she was beginning. I didn't regret it. I understood now that I never would. Whatever this was, and it was not safe, and it was not simple, and it would ask things of me I couldn't fully anticipate. It was also real. It was the most real thing in my life, and I had learned, somewhere between a stutter on a telephone and a hand around mine at a ladder rail, that real things are worth the weight of them. I drank my coffee in his kitchen, in the October quiet, and waited for the sound of the door.